Greetings. Christos Voskres. Hope all who celebrated had a happy and blessed Easter. My name is Nadia McConnell, president of and co-founder of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation. Welcome to this webinar. This is a very special webinar because we are marking the 10th anniversary of FOUN, Friends of Ukraine Network, and launching FOUN's 2024 priority recommendations for U.S. assistance to Ukraine that come from the two current primary task forces, the National Security Task Force, chaired by Ambassador John Herbst, and the 3R, Reimagining Reconstruction and Recovery of Ukraine Task Force, chaired by Anders Aslund. In marking the 10th anniversary of FOUN, permit me to share a few comments about the genesis and strategy of FOUN. Working on Ukraine issues for the past 6 decades, and certainly since Robert and I came to Washington for the second time in 1981 to serve in the Reagan administration, we have been keenly aware that most of the Washington policy community was, and perhaps still remains, Moscow-centered. Despite valiant efforts of various Ukrainian American organizations who, with historical support of Congress, have had numerous successful policy achievements, it has not been sufficient to match the deep-rooted Moscow-centric advocates. So we founded the U.S. Ukraine Foundation in 1991 to reach out beyond the Ukrainian American Committee for support, not only financially, but, as I call them, non-hyphenated Americans, to help the development of a genuine U.S.-Ukraine strategic partnership. There certainly was no need for another diaspora organization. We are not and do not represent ourselves as representing the community. There are numerous organizations that have that mission and role. In 2005 and then in 2012, we had a State Department grant to conduct a U.S.-Ukraine policy dialogue. Anders, you were part of that 2005 program, and Ed, you were part of the 2010. Through these programs, we were able to identify members of the policy community that were not Moscow-centric. Then, when Putin first invaded Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula in 2014, in March, we reached out to involve some of the exceptional foreign policy military expertise, not Moscow-centric, to create FOUN, and issued recommendations for sanctions that we believe could have maybe deterred Putin after his initial military war on Ukraine. Before I turn to Robert to introduce members of that initial group and those with us, I want to stress, well, first I would like to personally, on behalf of the foundation and myself, thank everybody for the extraordinary amount of work and support you do with us through the FOUN initiative. There are two guiding principles of FOUN. One, we are nonpartisan, but for two exceptions, we bring together Ukraine experts and supporters beyond the ethnic community. There are currently 35 members of FOUN, all of whom are very busy in their various roles with universities, think tanks, and other engagements. Modern communications allow them to exchange views, refine positions, and advocate for those positions, but it is hard to bring everybody together in one place at one time. We often say that there's probably not any other group like that, and that you are all working 24/7 on the issues important for our national security interest in Ukraine. But today we have, I think, 13 members who together span the entire life of FOU and its various task forces. Over to you, Robert.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. I'm Bob McConnell, one of the other co-founders of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation. As Nadia said, as soon as Putin invaded Crimea in March of 2014, we started bringing together Ukraine experts to consider what the United States needed to do to counter Putin's unprovoked attack and deter further aggression. The first thing that we did was mentioned. We brought together a group that included Anders Aslund, Ed Chow, John Herbst, David Kramer, and Dan Freed. Dan can't be with us this morning, but the others are. Because it was sanctions and it was focused on on the economic possibilities of deterrence, I will immediately go to Anders and that initial group to mention that, and then move into what um, to what their task force, the Reimagining, Reconstruction, and Recovery of Ukraine Task Force, is suggesting going forward. Anders, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a few words about our sanction proposals in 2014 and what actually was done. First of all, I think that something that was very good that the U.S. government did, it was that it sanctioned Putin's four closest cronies from St. Petersburg, who have all become multi-billionaires on tapping Gazprom on money through asset stripping and procurement contracts, primarily for building gas pipelines. Gennady Timchenko, Arkady and Boris Rotenberg and Yuri Kovalchuk, who all stayed very close to Putin. After this happened, Putin publicly complained at least 5 times that his closest friends had been sanctioned. And this was because of Crimea. More on what was done then. What really succeeded was that Crimea was economically isolated, and that has held all the time. You can say that that is a small beer, but it was succeeding. What was most important to my mind, it was the financial sanctions, which led to Russia's total foreign indebtedness being cut by half from in the last decade. Russia today cannot borrow money abroad with very minor exceptions. And that's important because that means that the Russian economy does not have financial assets available. That has been reinforced by the sanctions that came in 2022. But this was very much what we wanted then. And many people complain that the sanctions have not been that effective, but the simple fact is that Russia has not had real economic growth since 2014, and that has essentially been thanks to the financial sanctions. Of course, it's quite amazing that the sanctions on military equipment have not been more effective. And we have just learned that the Russian KH-101 cruise missiles contain lots of Western parts, including mainly from the United States. And this is completely unacceptable. I think that it will be changed, but that is very late in the game. It should have happened much earlier. And I leave to the Chow as the deputy chair of our economic task force to discuss the energy sanctions. So in short, the sanctions were relevant, but they were not very effective. And the general conclusions about the sanctions is that they might cost 2 to 4% of GDP in economic growth each year, which is significant, but it doesn't break an economy.
Well, thank you very much on this. First of all, I want to say what a pleasure it's been to work with this group. The process has been very collegial. We're talking about folks with long expertise in their specific fields, but also vast experience working in and on Ukraine for many, many years. So the process has been very smooth, although the circumstances under which we are gathered has not been the best. I think one of the lessons from 2014 that this group was able to anticipate and see around the corner, so to speak, is that unless we strengthen Ukraine economically, prepare it militarily, and weaken Russia economically, that a weak Ukraine would just be too tempting for Russia under Putin to come back for a second bite of the apple. It's not so much that we anticipated February of 2022, so much as, being able to prepare for the future and not just address the kind of the short-term conditions of the day and hope that tomorrow will somehow solve itself. That was never going to be the case. And I think that 2014 exercise was pretty good in demonstrating that. I mean, for example, on sanctions, I think one of the problems of the West, led by the United States, is trying to calibrate tools that we have so finely, waiting many months to decide what the oil price cap, as an example only. It took more than half a year before we figured out how to implement it. After telegraphing it in the summer of 2022, nothing was done until December of the same year, and then not working on enforcement. Every cop on the beat would tell you that rules would be violated if you don't enforce them. And so it really was until the end of last year, 2023, before the U.S. Treasury Department and the Office of Foreign Assets Control actually toughened its enforcement of sanctions, oil sanctions in this case, on Russia. And by telegraphing what we will be doing, we allow Russia to prepare on different means of evading sanctions, and instead of doing it in a substantive way. And I think in some ways we feel the same dilemma even today in 2024, is our government trying to fine-tune things, hoping for the best, instead of using all the tools in our command, both economically and militarily.
Anders, if I could, before we move completely into the new area of sanctions, David Kramer was the only one who was able to put his name on with mine. I mean, the only person with substance that was able to put his name on those original recommendations of sanctions. David might have a word to say about that.
First time I've been associated with the word substance, Bob, so thank you. I think the recommendations that we issued a decade ago were spot on, and I think have been proven right. The thing I would just add to what Anderson and Ed have said is that sanctions can't be the only part of the policy. Sanctions have to be part of a larger strategy, and that strategy has to include diplomacy. Phil Breedlove is really agreeing with that point.
Wow.
But the strategy has to be diplomatic, but it also has to be military. And I think when we look back and when the history is written about this period, the biggest mistake that was made, sanctions were not strong enough, they were not implemented effectively enough. But the biggest mistake that was made was to not provide Ukraine with the military assistance it needed at the time. And I think Ukraine has never fully recovered from that mistake, nor have we. We haven't learned the lessons from that mistake. So I think as we segue into discussions about national security, it's important to understand that the sanctions policy is only part of a larger strategy. Thanks.
Anders, back to you.
Thank you. I would very much agree with what David said, but we have to think back. It was only the shooting down on MH17 on the 17th of July 2014 that convinced the Europeans to go along with the U.S. sectoral sanctions that had been actually been imposed the day before the MH17 was shot down. And the sectoral sanctions as Ed talked about, energy sanctions, financial sanctions that I talked about, and also sanctions on military technology, which were far too weak. And that was quite important. And on the 17th of July, the EU was convinced that they had to go along. So at the end of July, 2 weeks later, the European Union got along with the sanctions. And this is the fundamental political basis that needs to be done. And here I would like to praise both the Obama administration and the Biden administration for having carried all of these countries together. Then it was 28 members of the European Union. Now it is about 50 Western countries. So also the East Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand are there, and even Switzerland of all countries has managed to join in the sanctions. And unfortunately, when you want to have a broad front, you also get somewhat weaker sanctions. But I completely agree with David that the US should have delivered arms much earlier. And the interesting point here, I leave it to our generals, is that Britain was the first country to come in with large-scale military training and also much of a serious military arms deliveries to Ukraine. So the West has woken up far too late and is not fully awake as yet. And to those who read French, I would strongly recommend Sylvie Kaufmann, former editor of Le Monde's book, The Blinded. Unfortunately, it's so far only available in French, but this is a total devastation of the German and French policy on Russia under Putin. And she explains how the different politicians thought and how they got it wrong. But it's a very severe condemnation. So this is what the US and the UK had to deal with. So this resistance was quite significant. Thank you.
So, Anders, before moving on perhaps to the current task force, we have John here from that original group of 2014. And I don't know if John, if you want to say something about 2014.
Look, we understood back in 2014 that Moscow's theft of Crimea and its then what we called hybrid war in Donbass was a direct strike at American interests. And very few people in the United States understood that, and even fewer in the broader West understood that. It's striking because, again, I've been in this fight now since the spring of 14. I think we began to make serious progress, at least among the Washington elites, a year or so later. And let me tell one anecdote. In September of 14, I was invited to come back to NDU, which I left for the Atlantic Council in the spring, to brief the then incoming head of the Marine Corps. And I'm having a senior moment, I'm forgetting his name, but he then became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in 2015. So someone will recall his name for me. Anyway, I had known him from my work on failed and failing states at the State Department. And I made the pitch that the Moscow aggression in Ukraine was a danger to NATO. And my friend, who I knew was a 2-star, who was then a new 4-star, said, "John, I hear what you're saying. I'm just not buying." That's pretty much an exact quote. In July of the following year, July of 15, he testified to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I could have written his talking points. It was all about how Putin's games in Ukraine were actually directed at NATO and the West. So we began to see movement, understanding, at least among Washington elites then, although never to the point of developing a clear, strong policy to make sure that Putin failed. Yes, you have to credit the Obama administration with a serious sanctions policy. Oh, that had probably more to do with Dan Fried, who was then our sanctions guru at the State Department, than President Obama, but they let that happen. And of course, we never armed Ukraine sufficiently way back when. We produced a report, our group, not just this group, but another group, arguing for giving Ukraine $1 billion a year in aid, military aid. Obama was not buying it because Russia had quote unquote escalation dominance, and we didn't have a vital stake in that war. But the point is the patterns that we see very much today, the timidity in sending Ukraine the ATACMS with longer range, F-16s, other advanced equipment, was there way back then. Our policy has come a long way in the right direction, but not far enough. And we're paying a price today, and our leadership is paying a price today, and Ukraine is paying an even greater price in blood.
Anders, do you want to move into the? I mean, I can't do anything but totally agree, and probably even more vociferously with John Herbst, who is very, very clear spoken, but a diplomat. I'm neither. But
You always out vociferous me, Bob.
Anders, you want to move into the task force recommendations?
Yeah, first of all, let me thank very much the task force, the economic task force that we have managed to put together, which I think is absolutely outstanding, and I'm happy that the members have been both active and very substantial. So we made a year ago 4 recommendations. Now we have expanded them to 7 economic recommendation. And if I may, I would like to mention the composition of the task force, which I think is quite outstanding. I've already mentioned Chow, and then we have a number of professors, quite outstanding ones. Professor Irina Paliashvili at MIT, also Simon Johnson at MIT, Professor Charles Becker, who's with us here now, and Professor Joseph Hughes of Drexler University. And then we have a few outstanding ambassadors, and Dan Fried, who has already been mentioned, Richard Morningstar, and Kurt Volker. And other members are Irina Paliashvili, the president of the Ukrainian legal group, who's with us today, and Morgan Williams, president of the U.S. Ukraine Business Council. And then we have Dr. Philip Zelikow, now at Hoover Institution. Previous, he was a professor at the University of Virginia. Nadia McConnell, of course, who's the president of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation. And last, but perhaps foremost, Robert Zelikow, former president of the World Bank, among other things. And what we have come up with is the most important demand is, first of all, seize the $285 billion of immobilized Russian central bank assets in the West. And here, particularly, Philip Zelikow have carried out a beautiful intellectual fight for why it is legally correct. We have also discussed why it's economically correct. There, it's particular Bob Zelikow has pushed the argument, and this must be done. It's the G7 that needs to take the initiative, and this should be done in June at the next G7 summit in Italy. This this money must be taken and it should be used for Ukrainian reconstructions. It's impermissible that Russia first attacks Ukraine completely legally and then claims that it has some kind of international legal right to maintain its assets in the West. It must be taken and used for Ukraine. Our second demand is indeed what is being discussed here in Washington now. The $61 billion for the Ukrainian support needs to be adopted by the U.S. Congress as soon as possible. And the third demand is that the U.S. should help Ukraine to maintain its Black Sea shipping lane that Ukraine very successfully has opened by taking out at least a third of Russian Black Sea Navy. And this is economically vital because close to 90% of Ukrainian exports go through the Black Sea. And it's far too expensive to take it by rail or truck. So the only economically viable way is through the Black Sea. And here we come to the military point that Russia must not be allowed to control Crimea, but that I leave to our generals. And then the fourth point is the EU accession, which from a US point of view, the central thing is to establish strong private property rights and free open markets, which are key to Ukraine's economic success, and of course also for foreign direct investment, which is a big agenda that I shall not go into. And then we also argue, as we did a year ago, that the collective West should establish a strong executive for Ukraine's reconstruction. We want a real Marshall Plan agency. The natural place for it is partly in Brussels, partly in Kiev. Clearly here the EU is taking the lead, but the US also needs to play part of it. And then the US should promote direct flights to either Kiev or to Lviv, because this is vital. Now you have to take train, and it should be quite possible to establish it. You wonder, but won't the Russians shoot down the planes? Well, Turkish Airlines flies is the main international airlines to fly on Moscow. So, and Turkish Airlines are ready to fly on Kiev today. So if Russia shoot down their plane, then they cannot expect that Turkish Airlines will continue to fly on Russia any longer. And then finally, a seventh demand that has come up is that it makes no sense to do any loan restructuring for the Ukrainian state as long as the war lasts, because it will not open international financial markets. Of course, all these demands are further specified and justified, but I just wanted to give them here in a brief. Happy to respond if there are any questions to them. Thank you.
Well, Anders, I think maybe some other members of your task force would be interesting. Well, among other things, I asked the question, did they just join the task force because you asked, or what's the link? I mean, their concerns and cares about what's going on, I think, is really manifested in their joining the task force and working with you.
Well, it's rather easy, Bob. Everybody has been engaged in one way or the other. So I just looked up on who has expressed interest through writing or in activities. So, for example, Irina Paliashvili worked together with me and Professor Uli Haber-Elishin in 2014 when Pavlo Sherebeta was Minister of Economy. He asked us to assist him. Simon Johnson and I worked together in 94 on the first economic stabilization program. Philip Zelikow and Bob Zoellick have engaged very much in public on the central bank reserves of Russia that should be taken for Ukraine, and so forth.
Do either Charles or Philip or Irina have anything they want to add at this point? If not, and there will be other chances going forward.
No. I think Bob wanted to say something.
Okay.
Well, Bob, it's Kurt, and I would like to jump in if there's a moment. One thing I just wanted to underscore, Anders did an excellent job presenting all of the ideas and recommendations. But the thing that I wanted to underscore for people is that all of these economic measures that Anders is talking about are essential for the military side. That is to say, for Ukraine to win the war, it needs to have an economy and a connectivity of its economy that is stronger than Russia's. And that's very achievable. The US and EU combined are well over 20 times Russia's GDP. We have a lot more capacity to bring to bear to integrate Ukraine into the rest of the world, but we have to do it. And we are lagging behind in our vision about the economic side of helping Ukraine win the war. And that's largely what all of these economic recommendations are aimed at, is making sure that this is part of a victory strategy.
Well, Charles, yes.
Yeah, I'll throw in just a little bit. First, I should say, Anders is being more modest than he should be. He's been instrumental, among other things, in developing the Kiev School of Economics from the get-go. And that's how we first came to know each other very well. I've been serving on that board. This is my 20th year. But Anders is the person who really steered it into the extraordinary success that it is today. Turning to the points that Kurt just made, I think it's, I've been working a lot on both strategies for reopening airports, but also the long run development strategies, and getting both capital and human capital, people to return to Ukraine in a sense of confidence, and especially those with skills, is a super important task. And we have both positive and negative examples from history of how this can be achieved.
So before Philip or Irina, did you want to say anything before we move on? No? Okay.
I will add one thing. Maybe there's somebody would comment on this. It is pretty clear that we're hearing more and more from Europe, at least, about corporations being really anxious to get back to quote unquote what they think is normal, which means doing business with Russia. This whole idea of improving Ukraine, we need to make Ukraine's economy attractive to Western business. When we opened the door by saying that Russia, when the Soviet Union came apart, our government declared that Russia was a democracy, and that broke a gauge, a dam that had been there. Western governments Western businesses did not do business in Russia because they would be accused of dealing with communists. So all those Western businesses rushed into Russia. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, And we saw people like us, Friends of Ukraine Network, on the Hill trying to push for sanctions and other support for Ukraine. Americans, businesses were registering to fight against sanctions. It took how long to get most of the Western businesses out, and they're anxious to get back. The difference between Ukraine and Russia in that context was that the Ukrainian economy was not strong in having businesses supporting it. So I think one of the goals is to build Ukraine's economy, help it build its economy so that you have Western interests, big business interests in Ukraine, part of the supporting and building that economy.
I would just note for his history that President Bush sent as the first ambassador to Russia, Bob Strauss, who was a top, I would say, wheeler dealer, a Democrat. And I would say he's the architect of getting all these Western companies to come into to Russia. And Robert, not everybody has left Russia, but people are working on it, I guess.
Well, with that, why don't we move to the National Security Task Force? And
Bob, I see Irina would like to come in.
Oh, okay, good. I can't see all the things at one time. Irina?
Just wanted to follow up on what you were saying, Bob. There are several organizations, voluntary organizations, that are naming and shaming those companies, but I think there should be also a legal aspect to this, because these companies who are still operating in Russia are paying directly for the war. They're paying billions of dollars in taxes that go straight to producing of missiles and other weapons that Russia is using against Ukraine. So I think the legal community, and we are working on that, is trying to come up with some sort of a concept that will punish those companies, because as we know, those companies that were involved with Nazis during the Second World War, they were punished afterwards. So they are directly paying for killing people in Ukraine, and there is such a thing as criminal liability of companies during the war. So there can be a pretty strong argument that this should not go unpunished. And those companies now are complaining that if, for example, the Russian sovereign assets will be confiscated in favor of Ukraine, then they will suffer, but in Russia. But Timesh wrote about it extensively, saying that they knew what they were doing. They knew the risks. They knew that the country they're investing in, they're paying taxes in, is using their taxes to wage the war against Ukraine. So I think this is something that we should pay much more attention to and highlight and work on some legal mechanisms, to make these companies also pay for what they're doing.
Let me just add to this, if I may, that the Kiev School of Economics, together with the Ukrainian government, the Ministry of Economy, had formed a list of 50 Western companies who name and shame list that have been particularly active in Russia. And the U.S. government informally approached the Ukrainian government and strongly requested that this list be taken down. It came out in Financial Times about 2 weeks ago. Apparently, the Ukrainian government has not agreed, but I know from internal sources that this was actually done by the U.S. government. It was at the same time as the U.S. government demanded that Ukraine did not bomb Russian oil refineries. These are completely illegitimate activities by the U.S. government. Thank you.
Anders, I'm glad you brought that up. I do want, however, because of some time restraints, to jump. We'll jump back and forth, but jump to the National Security Task Force that's chaired by John Herbst, and note that John has to leave fairly shortly, so we might go into Ben and Phil, and then get on to the NATO part of this too. John?
That sounds fine to me. So why don't we do this? Ben, why don't you take the floor first, and then if Phil needs to go soon after that, Phil, and then I'll come back in.
Okay, thank you. Because John Herbst, America's leading diplomat, scared the hell out of me, I managed to get an extra 20 minutes. So I don't want to screw up his batting order if he would prefer to lead off with Phil.
Okay, Phil.
Okay, Ben, I'll try to save you some time. I'll go very quickly. First of all, it's a privilege to be a part of the team that works these issues. It's a privilege to be a part of what I think are some of the most intelligent thinkers about Ukraine that I've ever served with. And I would also just add one more thing that sounds a little self-serving, but it's a privilege to be amongst people who are brave enough to actually say what they think and speak truth to power in our government. So I'm happy to be a part of this team. I'd like to just first hit about 4 things I heard where I was in the background cheering that others have said already on this broadcast. First of all, and I will, in the spirit of Chatham House, not call their names, but you know who they are. I want to totally agree, violently agree, that our government's position that Ukraine cannot bomb oil refineries in Russia is illegitimate. It's beyond illegitimate. I cannot use the words on TV that it is. This is about as bad a policy as our government could ever come up with. And we need to encourage Ukraine to use all tools in its box to go after Russia. I've listened, and I tell you, there's some really important and smart people about sanctions here. I continue to worry that sanctions aren't doing all the things we would want them to do. I think in a cumulative sense, they're beginning to really have some impact. So I'm eating a little crow on that because I've never been a huge fan of how much sanctions accomplish. But may I add that I believe that maybe we, but certainly our government, needs to start a whole new task force that goes after all the leaky holes in our sanctions. Every day now we're reading about someone else who has leaked technology or shared through third parties equipment to Russia that are built in America, a lot of it. And so we might consider how to help and how to bring pressure on our government that we begin to really get after the holes in the sanctions that Russia is managing to work through. I want to once again violently agree with the concept that was brought up that we cannot allow Russia to control Crimea. I know this is sound economic thinking, and I applaud the economic group. But Ben and I and others have been saying this for a long time as well, because Crimea is the key to northern Black Sea, and the northern Black Sea and getting Ukraine back in charge of its ports are important for economic growth in Ukraine after this war. We need to have security, and we need to have rule of law, and investors need to believe that those ports and opportunity and access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean are there. So I think we have to continue to push on our government to go after that. I really was taken by the concept that Russia has escalation dominance. I don't disagree with that, but I will say this: Russia having escalation dominance is a choice that the United States of America made. We allowed them to have escalation dominance. Ben and I have been to military schools in our life, and we study these old dead guys, Clausewitz, Jomini, Sun Tzu, and they all in their own way say a couple of things, all of them, not the same words, but they essentially say, deter your enemy and do not allow your enemy to deter you. We have failed. We have failed miserably at that. They also essentially say, again, not exactly these words, seize and maintain the initiative. That's a part of escalation dominance, seizing and maintaining the initiative. We gave the initiative away in this conflict before it started. We told Russia many times, if you do this, we'll do that. We became reactionary and gave the initiative to Russia. We need to do something about that. I love the phrase that has been used, no clear policy to ensure that Putin fails. This was the one thing I wanted to emphasize on today's meeting, and that is we need, in my humble opinion, a clear, publicly declaratory policy that we are about Ukraine winning. And winning, everybody tries to say, what is winning? I always say the same thing. Ask Ukraine and its people what winning is. I consistently hear all Russians out of all sovereign Ukrainian lands, and that includes Crimea, which is Ukrainian land. And so I believe that all these policies we have, like we'll be there for as long as it takes, we'll give them everything they need, they're all incomplete because we don't finish those sentences by saying to do what? And that is to throw all Russian forces out of all sovereign Ukrainian lands. Now, that's a fighter pilot who doesn't have a lot of words in his vocabulary. Ben is much more articulate. Maybe he can clean up my mess.
Ben?
Well, obviously, I agree with Phil that he does not have many big words in his vocabulary, but I would not agree with the rest of his comparison. I will, for one of the very few times, disagree with my friend Dave Kramer. The biggest mistake that we have made was our failure to clearly identify the strategic end state for this conflict. That's the biggest mistake, because all of these other things flow from having a clearly defined strategic end state, an objective, a purpose. We did not have a clear end state in 19 out of 20 years in Afghanistan. It ended in a disaster. And if you don't get the end state right, then nothing else is going to happen. That is job one. And while I'm proud of what the administration has done in so many levels, and certainly President Biden will be 1,000 times better president than Donald J. Trump, the Biden administration has failed miserably on doing this most important task, which is clearly identifying the strategic outcome. And then you can have the policies that flow from that. In 1942, when Churchill and Roosevelt met, actually December 41, January 42, they met for the first time in the Arcadia Conference. And U.S. Navy ships were still on fire, still smoldering in Pearl Harbor. No Americans wanted to get into a European land war against Germany. And yet Churchill and Roosevelt met together and realized that the strategic priority was to defeat Germany first, that they would not be able to get on the continent if Great Britain was lost, and that they needed what Great Britain brought if we were ever going to defeat Japan. So strategic priority, even though it was politically not popular. And they put together the British and American staffs together, and so that you had an effort. You could start organizing for victory. Mobilize your industries. Ford Motor Company, you're not going to make any more cars. Nobody's going to buy a car for the next 3 or 4 years. Westinghouse, nobody's going to buy a refrigerator for the next 3 or 4 years. You're going to make stuff that the military needs. And that's how the U.S. Army went from having the 17th largest army in the world, right behind Bulgaria, up to having almost 12 million men and women in uniform in the Army, Navy, and Army Air Corps by the end of the war. And then 1 year later, in 1943, January 43, at the Casablanca Conference, when Churchill and Roosevelt met again. And this time they added what is the strategic end state: unconditional surrender. Not we're going to fight Hitler until we get a better negotiating position, or we're going to try and improve our negotiating position with the Emperor of Japan. Unconditional, we're going to fucking crush Germany, Nazi Germany, and the Empire of Japan. I apologize. So my little historical point is that strategic clarity, priority, and objective is what enabled us to get out of the Depression and win this war with our British allies. That's what's missing right now. The Russians are at war with us, but we clearly are not at war with them. We somehow think that you're either at war or not at war. The Russians are always at war. It's just that they change the combinations of methods that they're using, from disinformation, to outright lying, to economic pressures, to nuclear threat, incredible brutality. Yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of Bucha. So until we start thinking about, all right, we're at war with these guys, and be able to explain that to our allies and our own population, we're going to continue to be surprised. Like, how come, why aren't they wanting to negotiate with us in good faith? I think that the doomers that are out there, I mean, some of you were at Munich Security Conference. You would have thought that we had completely lost the war, that it was all over. Just 5-6 weeks ago at the Munich Security Conference, people were talking about Avdiivka as if it was the fall of Stalingrad. Find a map. Avdiivka is about as far east in Ukraine as you can possibly be. And in 6 weeks since the Russians captured Avdiivka, they have not done anything because they can't do anything. They don't have the ability to exploit even something like that. But yet people in the West talk about, they cite Avdiivka all the time as an example that we're losing. Every interview I have, they start off by saying, oh my God, it's really bad in Ukraine. Yeah, it's really bad if you're a Russian private. Absolutely, it's bad. It's really bad if you're in the Russian Navy. It's terrible. So clearly, if we don't help with ammunition and that sort of thing, it's going to continue to get worse for Ukrainian ground troops. But this narrative that's out there that Ukraine is losing, I think we have got to stop that, because that narrative, which is driven by the Kremlin and enabled by some unbelievably pathetic figures, even in Washington and Berlin and other places, is intended to cause us to lose hope. Like, come on, for the sake of peace, let them have Crimea. Why? So after 10 years of war, Russia controls about 20% of Ukraine. 10 years of war with every advantage. Almost 500,000 casualties later, the Black Sea Fleet is down a third, and they're having to pull out of Sevastopol. The Russian Air Force has failed to achieve its two main tasks: air superiority and interdiction of the lines of communication from Poland into Ukraine. So I don't know why people are being such doomers, and the Russians for sure do not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war. So in conclusion, what needs to happen this year? I think the 4 priorities are: number 1, keep putting pressure on Crimea and on Russian oil and gas infrastructure. Ukrainians are doing that, whether we're helping them or not. They have got to do it. And I think increasingly European countries are starting to pick up some of our embarrassing slack. Number 2, I think General Syrski's task is to stabilize the front. Make sure that Russia does not use their mass to overrun or get closer to Kharkiv, for example, or achieve some sort of breakthrough somewhere else. But the purpose is to buy time for priority number 3, which is to rebuild the Ukrainian army. It's incredible to me that a country that has over 2 million women and men of military age, that you hear about manpower problems in Ukrainian armed forces. This is appalling to me, and it will undermine support of Western countries if Ukrainians are not willing to do everything necessary to get women and men into properly trained, properly equipped new units. That's what's needed so that you can have a rotation. And then the 4th priority for this year is that we have got to help Ukraine win the war, win the industrial competition, not only with their own industry, but our industry. I mean, Russia is in trouble, big time trouble. But because we're not competing in this industrial competition, they're going to eke out a victory unless we get serious about not only producing ammunition, but also pushing maintenance forward into Ukraine. In the Army, we talk about fix forward. Don't drag stuff to another country to fix it. Get it fixed up forward so that you can put it back into the fight. That's what I think our 4 priorities this year have got to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. John, his picture doesn't show up here, but we might be able at this point to sandwich our fabulous Lieutenant General Hodges with another 4-star because Wes is on here and would like to say something.
Please do it. Wes?
I have an email from him that he's watching and he's on, but I can't see him.
Wes, are you there?
We'll have to figure out that connection. Let's go on and we'll get him.
There he is. He just popped up.
All right.
Oh, there
I got
hands up.
Look, I want to, first of all, I agree with what Ben has said. I agree with what Ben and what Phil has said. But I want to just emphasize one thing. I think we've got a major opening with the French statement. And I think we need to follow on that French statement. It is about getting France to come in and support Ukraine with forward forces. And so the Ukrainians have asked for fix forward, Ben. I know this because Ukrainians told me that that General Syrskyi asked the French general for it last week. France hasn't responded. And the fix forward is the easiest, least risk, and still very useful effort that could be made to give extra fighting power to the Ukrainian forces. The latest is that France is interested in supporting Odessa. I think that we should encourage a precautionary deployment of French forces to the Odessa region because that's clearly a Russian strategic objective, and it clearly is out of the line of fire right now for ground contact, and it does further provide some level of deterrence. So those are the 2 immediate things I would ask that we focus on. And finally, just to underscore Ben's point and Phil's point about policy, this administration hasn't faced reality on what Russia represents and what Putin intends. There was a 60-minute show last night that some of you may have seen. And of course, the truth is that we don't want to admit that Russia is really at war with us, and we don't want to face up to the consequences. So I think we just need to do everything we can in a full court press to face reality of what the United States is facing. It's a new era. We got 4 major powers, or 4 significant nuclear powers lined up against us. They're willing to use force. Strategic nuclear weapons count. We're decoupled from Europe. Our armed forces need fixing. The Army, Navy, missing their recruiting objectives. All the forces are too small to do what's asking for. And this administration is still talking about the power of the example, when in fact the U.S. political system is a major theater of combat operations as far as the Russians are concerned. And we haven't faced up to our own internal security responsibilities. So I think we've got some huge issues to deal with just beyond Ukraine. And I don't want to misuse the Free Friends of Ukraine, but I think to be honest, it's not just about Ukraine. It's a much bigger issue than Ukraine. Thank you very much. Thanks, Bob.
Sure. David, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. First, let me just agree with the three general friends. I think all the comments were spot on. I do want to pick up on Ben's comment about the narrative, and I think this is critically important. And I think we saw this start to shift with the counteroffensive that didn't live up to the hopes that some had. But as I think Ben and Phil and Wes would agree, we set them up to fail, not to succeed, because we didn't provide them the means to conduct an effective and successful counteroffensive. I think the three of you would have resisted any orders that would not have included air cover for such a mission. But the narrative, I think, is critically important because, as Ben said, that right now everyone thinks that the Russians are winning, the Ukrainians are losing, and it's time to negotiate and sacrifice millions of Ukrainians to live under Russian repression. And that, of course, is grossly inaccurate. As Ben mentioned, the Russians have suffered close to 500,000 casualties since February of 22. The Ukrainians regained more than 50% of the land that Russia seized. They're down to the last 18%, which shouldn't be a shock that that is the toughest to regain, but that's where we are. The Russian conventional armed forces have been essentially cut in half. The elite Russian forces have been decimated. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has lost a third of its ships and the capability of using Sevastopol as a port. The Ukrainians have restored and maintained the export corridor through the Black Sea. The drone attacks by Ukraine on Russian refineries have forced Russia to import energy from Belarus. Think about that for a minute. That is the damage Ukraine is doing, despite this horrible uncertainty that has been hanging over them for months, not knowing whether they will be resupplied or not. They have had to husband a lot of the ammunition and weapons that they've been using, given that uncertainty, and yet still they have been able to achieve tremendous success. So Ben is absolutely right that the narrative that is prevailing out there needs to be corrected because it is not an accurate portrayal. Is morale down on the Ukrainian side? I would say it is because of us. It's not because of them. It is because of the uncertainty that we have been producing on our side, not knowing whether we will continue to provide the assistance. And the last thing I'll say is, I think this vote in the Congress is arguably the most important vote that the Congress has faced in decades. I hope Speaker Johnson, in talking about finding a way to move ahead with assistance, will be able to do so, even if it costs him his speakership. He would go down for doing the right thing if that were to happen. But Congress needs to act quickly when it comes back from its recess. Every day that passes is a deadly day for Ukraine, and I hope we can reverse that. Thanks.
If I might just, underscore what Ben and David were just saying about the narrative or the morale. I think we have to be really mindful that whatever narratives are out there, they are impacting the Ukrainians. And I think what we're hearing is because of all of this doom and gloom thought, their morale is impacted by the narratives that we put out. And if we are saying that they're losing, then that obviously is going to have a negative impact on morale. So I think we need to double up our efforts to talk about the successes. Thank you.
Charles, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm talking about policy because that's not what I'm good at. But I'd like to reiterate, and especially what General Clark said. I happened to be, just by chance, working in Almaty, Kazakhstan on 9/11, and I heard President Putin's speech at that time. And basically what he said was, "We feel your pain." It was President Clinton could have given that talk. And whatever you want, America, Russia's with you. But what I heard him actually saying was, America and Russia, we can divide the world between us if you agree. And the United States did not do that. I don't want to say much about the way our policy was handled about Russia at that time in the following years. However, it clearly became a chip on the Putin government's shoulders. and they've never been able to shake that. I do believe that General Clark is spot on when he says the real adversary is the United States. And the other work, actually back to research that Kai-Chow Chang and I have done looking at the redevelopment of secret cities, shows that there's been a remilitarization. There's been growth in those secret cities, according to satellite data, since well before 2014. So this is something that we have ignored, but as General Clark says, it is it's reality.
John, back to you.
All right, this has been a very, very good conversation, but heading off in a variety of directions. I'm going to try and pull it all together. Of course, our report this year, as in years past, has focused on the need to us to define our objective in Ukraine as victory, something the administration has not chosen to do, which has led to an overall weaker effort. But I think Wes pointed out something even more important than that, which we should really put at the very top of our agenda, which is, this follows also what Charles just said, Russia has not hidden the fact that we are, as their foreign intelligence chief, Nadishkin, said, their principal adversary. And they have been waging a hybrid war against us for years. The latest, as Wes pointed out, was made clear to the American public last night that the Havana syndrome injuries coming from lasers is of Russian origin. And they have not randomly, they picked out American professionals and across our government who have been working on Russia as a problem, and they have attacked them with this. And this is just one more example that Russia is coming for our breakfast. The numerous cyber attacks which emanate from Russia, right? We had our intelligence officials testifying on the Hill late last month that 80% of them come from Russia. Another sign. And yet the administration has not identified that Russia, in fact, is doing this. And Russia is, in fact, our adversary. This is a problem. The Republicans largely have talked about China as our adversary, and they're right that China is in the long run more dangerous than Russia, because China, unlike Russia, has a real economy, although not quite as strong as we seem to think it is, and Russia does not. But Russia's the one that's conducting a more provocative and aggressive policy right now, including a full-scale war in Europe. So we need to understand that Russia is our foe. If we understand that, defining victory in Ukraine becomes easier. Explaining why support for Ukraine to defeat Russia is not philanthropy, it's a vital interest of the United States. So we need this clarity, which we don't have, and the lack of clarity is a direct flaw, a major flaw in the administration's policy. Relating to this flaw and the current stall, 6-month stall in aid to Ukraine, which we can lay at the feet of the Republicans, has done something very important and very dangerous for the United States. It has eroded our influence. We are not the undisputed leader of the free world right now because of the tentativeness of our policy. I was in Munich with Ben at the security conference in February. That was evident there. I've been in Kiev twice, 5 weeks ago and 2 weeks ago, and it was not evident there. Now, I am normally not a fan of French diplomacy. The French love to tweak us, and France has been a weak sister in policy towards Russia for the last 10 years. But French policy has changed in the right direction, and I, like Wes, welcome the strong statements made by Macron about putting soldiers in Ukraine. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but it's important that this start the debate, because someday we may need to do that. The point is the French see a leadership vacuum. This is the ultimate tweak on Washington. And that's one of the reasons why Macron sounds as tough as he does. And this leadership vacuum is a bipartisan affair. Now, I will not say that Mitch McConnell shares in that. McConnell's been great. Risch has been great. But obviously, the overall thrust of Republican policy we see right now in the House, and that's very damaging. But they have been, in fact, enabled by the administration, which has been intimidated at every step of this 2+ year crisis by the threat of Moscow's nuclear escalation. So there's been kind of a weird synergy between the White House and the MAGA Republicans, which explain weakness in American policy, which is, again, destroying our credibility overseas. It's eating away at it. Now, we can recover, and that recovery will hopefully come when the Congress comes back. I think Johnson does want to get the aid bill done. I think he also does not want to lose his job, and he may not have the choice of being able to do both. But I think ultimately we will get the aid package done because most Democrats and enough Republicans talk about signing a discharge petition, which will force a vote on the aid package, even if Johnson does not want to put it on the floor. So I suspect we will see that aid package passed, smaller, less economic component, maybe a loan part of it, but enough to get the job done for the short and medium term. But what we need, again, is a recognition that Moscow is our foe or our enemy, a determination to deal with that, in which case the place to do it, the smartest place to do it is in Ukraine. To do that, we have to stop being intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. We need to send Ukraine all the weapons, and our military advisory, which we see here, also supplemented by Deborah Kagan, who's not on this call, has explained all the weapon systems we need to send, starting with the longer range ATACMS, but a whole list of other things. And we need to make sure that Putin is defeated. This can be done without nuclear war. And in fact, if we let Putin intimidate us into allowing him to win in Ukraine, we will face the same nuclear threats in the far harder to defend Baltic states. And we will face our day of reckoning in any case. All right. Two other very important. I'm sorry, Bob, you want something?
No, I was gonna jump in on, you said that we can reclaim our leadership, which I think brings us to something that we have a time frame on, and that is NATO's summit next summer.
I'm coming to that.
and Kirk's gonna have to go.
Oh, okay. Well, 2 points. All right, and then I'll turn to Kirk to talk about NATO. Well, actually, one is NATO. One, in order to do this, and in order to protect ourselves against the marching authoritarians, that includes China, especially next to Russia, as well as North Korea and Iran, we need to do something which we have been talking about but not doing, something which has been pointed out we did beautifully in the 1940s, which is build up our military industrial production. We had, what, 3 or 4 aircraft carriers when the Japanese attacked? By 1944, we had over 30. We can do this. We just have to decide it's a priority. Because if we were to stop sending any weapons to Ukraine and found ourselves at war with either Russia or China, we would not have the arms to do it. So we need to get that thing going. And if we do that, sending Ukraine all the arms it needs, again, is a smart way to defeat Russia and no skin off our nose, our other defense requirements. The last point, and I'll then turn over to Kirk because this is his area. We need to anchor Ukraine firmly in the West. That can only be done by putting Ukraine into NATO. And that means we need to take serious steps at the Washington NATO summit in July to do that. We failed to do it in Vilnius. I believe the same timidity that has kept us from sending ATACMS to Ukraine, the longer range ATACMS and other things, and that led to such a poor outcome at the Vilnius NATO summit, is again at work in the White House and in the Chancery. And with that introduction, Kurt, if you're still here, I don't see you. It's all yours. Otherwise, I can take this up.
Oh, I am still here and happy
There you are.
Let me also, I see Sandy's picture on my screen, so I want to just point out that Sandy's here and have done a lot of writing and thinking about how to advance Ukraine to NATO, specifically at the Washington summit. A lot has been said that I agree with, and I think it is important, as many people have said, that we have to recognize, as you said, John and Wes, that Russia sees us as its adversary, and it is working very hard to fight us. It has limited means now, but with more means at its disposal over time, it would do more. We should not kid ourselves. We actually have a moment in time where we are in a vastly superior position, and we should be taking advantage of that. Now, I want to say a couple of things. I'm trying to figure out what the right order is. Let me start with the signal to Vladimir Putin. What does NATO currently signal to Putin? From the Bucharest summit onward, 2008, Georgia, Ukraine, we have signaled to Putin that we do not have the resolve to provide security for countries in Central and Eastern Europe who are not already members of NATO. We're not going to do that. And the Vilnius summit was a case in point where we specifically said that Ukraine will be invited to join NATO when there is a consensus among the allies and when Ukraine is ready, which translated means we do not believe that Ukraine is ready, and there is no consensus to bring them into NATO. Otherwise, we would have done it at Vilnius. So that is a signal to Putin that he can keep going. What we are teeing up for the Washington summit right now is the same thing. It is on the one issue that Putin is watching. Are we going to bring Ukraine into NATO or not? We're going to send the same signal. Say, no, we're not. And that will be a green light for Putin to keep the war going. We instead need to be sending the opposite signal through all of the means that people have already been talking about on this call. We need to be sending to Putin the signal that he cannot win. He will not win. We will not allow him to win. And in fact, he will be defeated. That is the message he needs to get, and he's not getting. Now, the way to do that is first, as everyone has already said, give Ukraine what it needs, set the strategic goal of victory, and then make it happen. So victory. Then you need peace. And then you need to guarantee the peace. You need to preserve the peace. And that's what NATO does. NATO is the ultimate war prevention mechanism. And our goal should be to prevent a further and wider war. And the only way to do that is to bring Ukraine into NATO and start shutting it down. What the Biden administration has done in their effort to prevent a wider war is to do everything possible to avoid escalation and to signal to Russia things that we will not do. This has given Putin the green light to keep taking and keep going, knowing that he is safe doing so. It's actually fueling the war rather than preventing the expansion of the war. Now, this has been going on for a long time. It's been going on since 2008, and then soon after that, the reset policy. It's been going on since 2014 with the real lack of resolve in doing anything about Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And it has been going on steroids now since February 22, when we have been very actively communicating with our words and our deeds what we will not do, which is giving Putin the opportunity to expand the war as much as he wants in safety. So what we need to do is flip this around. So we need to be signaling that he needs to be unsure of what we will do. He needs to know he will never win. And we need to start setting the stage for what the end of the war looks like, which is no gray zones in Europe. That there will be a border, and we will police the border as a NATO border. That's where we have to go. And the final point I wanted to make, which is getting to Wes's and others' points about this is a bigger issue than Ukraine. The warning signs for a much bigger war are already out there. And I'm going to just tick them off. There are quite a few. There is Putin's stated aims, which is the restoration of the Russian Empire and ensuring that there are no independent governments on what Russia considers to be Russian territory. And this would include all of Ukraine, but could very well include all of the Baltic states, parts of Poland, Finland, and so forth. Those are his stated aims. I just came back from the Baltics, from Vilnius. The amount of hybrid mischievous activity going on there is at an all-time high since 1991. They are paying for protests against the Lithuanian government. They have people going around taking down Lithuanian flags from public places. They have people throwing paint onto Lithuanian statues. They beat up Navalny's deputy, Leonid Volkov, in Vilnius with a meat hammer. They have engaged in a lot of other, what we would call hybrid activity to increase tensions within Lithuania. They've done the same thing in Estonia. They have paid for protests in Poland. They've amplified these farmer protests in Poland. They have been clipping deliberately Polish airspace with missiles. One of them, a cruise missile, flying around for 39 seconds before going into Ukrainian territory to see whether NATO had the resolve to do anything about it. We should have taken a page out of Erdogan's book and shot it down, but we didn't do that. We have Putin, as you mentioned, John, using these lasers and creating Havana syndrome symptoms with a senior U.S. official at the Vilnius summit. We have the decision not to renew the mandate at the UN for monitoring North Korea sanctions. We have Russia collaborating with North Korea instead and getting ammunition from North Korea. Some estimates as high as 60% of their artillery shells coming from North Korea. We see active collaboration not only with North Korea, but also with Iran. And we see the war in the Middle East, which was launched by Iran, unleashing Hamas on Israel, Israel responding to that, the Houthis in Yemen making this a wider war, to which we have begun to respond, but only in half-hearted measures again. Israel has now struck targets in Syria, Hezbollah targets. This also runs the risk of a wider war. You mentioned, John, that 80% of the cyber attacks against the U.S. are coming from Russia right now. We saw the murder of the Russian helicopter pilot in Madrid, or in Spain. He had flown his helicopter into Ukraine as a defection, but then moved to Spain and then was murdered by Russian agents there. And you can go on, but all of the signs of a wider war are already there. I should add the vast commitment to defense industrial production and defense capability that Russia has made, seeking a 1.5 million man army. This is not only about Ukraine, but this is about gearing up for a wider war. We need to recognize it. We need to prevent it. And the only way to prevent it is to defeat Putin now, close the gray zones, and create a border that is strong enough that Putin would not try to breach it. Otherwise, I fear we are in a very much a 1938, 1939 moment when actions that we are taking are actually contributing to the escalation of this war rather than preventing it.
John, before David has to go, I'd like to have him say whatever he wants to add to Kurt or anything else on the discussion. David?
Well, I don't have much to add at this point. I agree with Kurt. I thought that was spot on. I will say that if we don't pass additional assistance for Ukraine, the NATO summit is going to be an absolute mess. I mean, in some respects, I don't mean to sound flippant about this. We should almost postpone it. If we can't get the assistance passed, what good is NATO going to do at this summit? This summit is going to be about Ukraine, I think. And if we can't get this assistance passed by July, I think is when it is, then it borders on disaster. I hope that isn't what some people in this country want for political reasons, but we should want to have a successful NATO summit that features a real serious pathway for Ukrainian membership. So these two things, I think, are very closely connected. And apologies that I'll have to drop off in a few minutes, but thank you for this.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Sandy, are you there? If you want to say something about NATO? Or not, as the case may be.
John, I'm going to have to drop off, and I'd like to add one point.
Go for it.
You mentioned what's likely to happen in the House. I just wanted to call people's attention to Mike Johnson's interview on Fox News yesterday, where he set out the terms that he expects to go forward in the House. Three things that he would do to amend the Senate legislation. One of them is to authorize or to approve the seizure of Russian assets and deploy them toward Ukraine. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. Second is to make a part of the assistance a loan. It's not as good as direct assistance. I think it will be for the economic, the budgetary support. But again, loan is what we did for the UK in World War II. I see no reason why we should hesitate to say that loans for Ukraine are a good idea. And thirdly, he wants to reverse the Biden administration's decision to stop approving LNG exports. This, again, is a very good policy idea. It is probably going to be the hardest lift with Democrats. But I think if people are serious about getting aid to Ukraine, this is a package that hopefully will get through. And it's one that he would do without this discharge procedure, and one that may actually gain him the votes to be able to do this and keep his speakership. So I just wanted to highlight those elements.
Kurt, thank you. I agree with your assessment on the LNG on both sides, how it's the right policy, but it might make it harder to actually get a vote through. So I saw his statement last night. I was not fully encouraged by it, but I see the positive elements in it. Sandy, I see you're now with us live. You want to jump in on NATO?
Yeah, a lot has been said already, with which I agree wholeheartedly. I think Kurt gave a great presentation a few minutes ago. It's clear that the administration is still hesitating both to provide sufficient weaponry to Ukraine and to take a serious step forward on NATO. I think it would be sad irony if they actually do find a way to get a deal with Johnson, but then they maintain the same kind of self-imposed constraints on ATACMS and all the other systems that they need, or in the numbers that they need to get back on the offensive in the war. I still think there's still a debate going on in the administration. I hope to learn more. I'm about to go off and see some folks to come up with some kind of more credible step forward on NATO membership. Not an invitation, but I think something that could genuinely be portrayed as sort of beginning the integration process for Ukraine. I hope that is the case. But if they end up with nothing but a warmed over Vilnius, I agree that what David just said, that postponing the summit might not be a terrible idea. Clearly, that's not going to happen. So we have to do what we can in the remaining time to convince the administration that a serious path to NATO membership has to be part of any credible outcome at the Washington summit, and also that a strategy for victory, using the V word if possible, is also essential. Otherwise, U.S. influence and credibility is going to erode, even with a deal on the supplemental. I hear you, John.
I'll make two more points on the broader implications for U.S. leadership, and for that matter, for U.S. security. The one thing that we have not mentioned, which is very important, is that if we in fact permit Putin to win in Ukraine by not providing the support that only we can provide, we are buying a crisis in the South China Sea. It's not a coincidence that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan has said, if you want to deter Xi from striking at Taiwan, make sure Putin loses in Ukraine. So this is something which should, one, be a spur to those Republicans who claim China is our foe to provide aid to Ukraine. It should also be a spur to the administration to send the weapons that Ukraine needs to actually turn the tide on the battlefield. That's point one. Point two, I think that the same timidity that we have seen that has stayed the administration's hand in sending Ukraine the weapons it needs, we've seen as well in our policy in the Middle East. We have now had well over 100 attacks on American soldiers at our various bases in Syria and in Iraq, and our response has been as timid as it's been in Ukraine. The Houthis are wreaking havoc with international shipping in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and we do sporadic attacks on the Houthis instead of taking a serious step against those who are providing the Houthis with the technology and the means to use that technology. If you want to stop the Houthis, you can't just strike at the Houthis. We need to find some way to deliver a serious counterstrike in the Middle East. So the same instincts that we see in Ukraine, the same timid instincts, which again is a polite word, we're seeing elsewhere, creating additional chaos and additional questions about American leadership. But the easiest way for us to answer those questions is for the White House to step up and send the weapons needed, for the MAGA Republicans to understand that appeasing Putin is not going to make America great again and defeat the Russians in Ukraine, and build up our arms industry to make sure if there's a confrontation between us and either Russia or China, we can handle it relatively easily. Bob, over to you.
Well, John, I think we have put so many things on the table, and I think probably everybody has a comment or two to add. But I do want to bring in one person. In the recommendations that we're making that are on the way to the publisher, we don't talk about propaganda and the misinformation that we deal with constantly. But our expert on the task force in that is Don Jensen, and I'd like to have him step in and say a few words about what we're facing in that area and what we could or should be doing that we're not doing in that area. Don?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm getting over a cherry blossom-induced allergy, so forgive my voice, please. Nadia, it's great to see you back. Yeah, I sometimes cringe at the P word, Bob, propaganda, and even the D word, disinformation. I remember my good friend Ben Hodges and I about 8 years ago had a long debate about the trade-off between kinetic and non-kinetic, the balance between kinetic and non-kinetic Russian activity. And the point of, I would argue, and I think Ben agreed at the time, was that it's not black and white, it's a continuum. And Russia chooses the weapons, the arsenal of tools to advance its interests. And sometimes it's invading, sometimes it's killing people in the West, in Spain, as I think Kurt mentioned. Sometimes it's weaponizing culture, and all the time it's weaponizing the Orthodox Church, if you've seen the developments over the weekend. So, number one, my point would be that you have to see it in a broader sense than just information operations, although, of course, that is central and very important. There are many things going on. It's multidimensional. I hate to use the word gray zone, but whatever you want to call it, Russia is advancing or trying to advance on almost every possible front. Second, compared to, say, the 2014-15 time period, the dimensions of the threat are increasing. We have cultural, religious, criminal activity all advancing Russian interests. And my point here would be that that's going to continue even if there is a peace on the battlefield. We have to keep that in mind. I think too often we don't keep that in mind. So it's going to continue whether whoever side wins, whether it's a ceasefire or not, and we have to always keep that in mind. And yes, Ukraine is a battleground for looking at disinformation and its effects. It's also a battleground for these other ways that Russia threatens its neighbors and threatens the rest of the West. Second, the challenge is ever evolving, and it's evolving quickly. You've seen all the obsession with AI recently. That's the latest, but Russia moves quickly. We seem always to be reacting or creating government agencies that react to the threat as it was 4 or 5 years ago. And that's really, really, I think, ill-advised. Third would be that I think it's safe to say that the level of Russia's activity independent of the Ukraine war has increased rather than decreased since February of 2022. And we can argue how, It's a great topic. I've spent a lot of time on it. We can now argue how successful it is or has not been. But I would argue strongly that the threat in that regard, in the non-kinetic dimension, has seriously increased. And that goes to intelligence service activities. It goes to killing fighter pilots in Ukraine. It goes to the decree we saw, the alleged document we saw about the Russian Orthodox Church in the past couple of days. We have to keep that in mind. And finally, I don't understand why we are not quicker off the bat. And finally, I think we ought to do far more exploitation. Let me use an important word: exploitation of the vulnerabilities of the Putin regime. It can be done. I mean, Putin gives us opportunities, whether it's Prigozhin, whether it's the Navalny murder, whether it's the terrorist act in Moscow 10 days ago. I don't see any talk about taking advantage of those things. There are clearly parts of Russian society that are at least ambivalent about the war and in some cases strongly opposed. Again, I don't see we do enough about all of this. Like with the weapons situation, John, we seem to be always on the back foot. And I don't understand quite why, when what is needed is not creation of a huge government agency like you know what, but it's diagnosing the vulnerabilities and trying to exploit them. You've got Central Asian allies former allies of Russia that are nervous. It's all over the place. And again, I would strongly urge that more work be done, perhaps in this group, on talking about those vulnerabilities and coming up with meaningful and effective policies that address them. I think with some hope of success. Over to you.
I would agree, Don, I agree with all those things. And again, it all comes from the fact that we have not identified Russia as an adversary of the United States and developed a policy designed to deal with that, which would and should be comprehensive. I just want to make one more. You mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow and how it's been weaponized by the Kremlin. They're now calling for a holy war in Ukraine against the Satanism of the West, among other things. They've also been severely repressing all non-Russian Orthodox Moscow Patriarchate Christians in Ukraine, especially evangelicals, who are considered by definition to be rogue elements. And it's amazing that many evangelicals in the United States now seem to be understand what's happening to their co-religionists in occupied Ukraine, in fact, and in Russia. Because this might help move the debate in that part of our political spectrum in terms of dealing with the Russian threat to the United States. I think.
Go ahead. Yeah, I agree.
I think Phil Zelikow had something to say. Phil, if I'm wrong, you don't need to say anything. Otherwise, time to jump in.
I was only intervening to be sure folks have a correct understanding of the use of the term loans and what Speaker Johnson is proposing and the kind of ideas that are currently in play. The loan concept has almost nothing to do with the military assistance part of the legislation. You do the military assistance in three ways. You do it through drawdown authority out of existing stocks. Loans are not a meaningful concept for drawdown authority. You do it by buying arms from American suppliers and shipping the arms to Ukraine. Again, loans are not a meaningful concept in that context. You could apply the loan concept to the third area of helping Ukraine, which is foreign military financing support, FMF support. But I think that's unlikely, actually, that that will run the loan concept into that column. So mostly when people talk about using loans, they're mainly talking about using loans in the economic assistance part of the package. And in the economic assistance part of the package, it's not meaningful to use loans in money you appropriate to USAID to provide humanitarian aid, right? So the only area really where the loan concept is applying is in the macroeconomic financial assistance that might be colloquially termed budget support. Of course, that's really important for Ukraine, but I just wanted folks to see in the $61 billion package, this is maybe like, oh, let's think of it as a $10 billion slice of that package that is disproportionately prominent to the Republican critics, and that and that's what they're playing around with in that sense. I'll just add, I don't think Speaker Johnson himself understands very much about the substance of this package, which is telling. He made a comment, for instance, that referred to the Russian assets issue, which he loved. I think he referred to it as pure poetry, but he thinks it has to do with Russian oligarchs. He doesn't even really understand that the legislation people have given to him doesn't touch really the oligarchs at all. But never mind, right? But this group does kind of need to understand a little bit of the substance, because people lean on folks in this group for expertise.
Phil, if I may jump in, could you inform us slightly about how you see the prospects for the Repo Act now on the Hill? I presume you are following that most closely among us.
Yeah. I think it's going to be in the package that the Republicans are going to assemble and try to get passed in about a week to 10 days that they'll unveil. That package may include things in it that the Democrats can't go along with, especially on the border. And and so there's an interesting issue, but I think a repo act of some kind, reconciling the House and Senate versions of the act, will be in the Republican package that the Speaker will try to pass, perhaps under a suspension procedure where he will need a lot of Democratic votes in order to pass it. Depending on the content of that package, sadly, that won't settle the issue, because it may have a lot of bad stuff in it that Democrats will swallow hard and vote for, with the belief that that bill will then go to conference with the Senate, and then there'll be a subsequent set of negotiations and procedures, maybe leading to the passage of a bill in May. But I think it will include Repo Act. For those of you who are asked for advice about the Repo Act, it's fine, of course. It's not the essential hurdle in moving forward on Russian assets, one way or the other. The one thing I would ask folks to focus on, if they have input on the legislation, is be sure it applies to offshore U.S. dollar accounts. So it needs to take an expansive view of American jurisdiction over Russian central bank assets denominated in U.S. dollars. This group may not fully be aware, but there is quite a lot of Russian central bank assets that are denominated in U.S. dollars. The vast majority of that is not held in U.S. territory. It is held in offshore dollar accounts. The United States government has a legal basis for jurisdiction over offshore dollar accounts, because all offshore dollar accounts are held in partnership with correspondent banks in the United States. And all the management of the U.S. dollar accounts, reinvestment, conversion from securities to cash, all of that is actually run through the correspondent banks in the United States. They have to have banks in the country that issues the currency. So that's how the U.S. government has actually in the past exercised jurisdiction over offshore dollar accounts. The Russians were very careful to move as much of their money as possible, including in dollars, outside of the territory into accounts that were held outside by institutions that were domiciled outside of the United States, like Euroclear, or in Japan, by the way. But all of those institutions have a correspondent banking relationship that's still inside the United States. I'm sorry if that seemed a little bit technical, but when we're talking about whether or not we get access to, let's say, an extra 40 or 50 billion dollars, technicalities are worth knowing.
Philip, isn't it true that if we do that, if we do what you suggest, that would make it more likely that the Europeans with Euroclear would make the right decisions on the frozen asset?
in my view, it would. The Europeans don't want a really difficult conversation over whether or not the United States has jurisdiction over all these offshore accounts that are frozen in U.S. dollars involving the Russian central bank. That's just that will, I believe, well, we have in prior cases for other reasons, we have established that jurisdiction. And by the way, there's a similar story for British, Canadian, Australian holdings, which are substantial, and British in particular. So the Europeans don't really want to have a bruising confrontation over whether we have jurisdiction over Russian assets denominated in our own money that the Russians tried to hide from our scrutiny by depositing them in accounts that are domiciled in other countries, but held in partnership with banks in our country. So nearly 40% of Euroclear's accounts are not in euros. I don't think this is very well understood.
Phil, just a point of clarification. Does the current formulation of the Repo Act not include these offshore dollar accounts?
Well, that's a nice question. It's just not, it's not 100% clear. In my view, it would be nice to add an extra dollop of clarity to that matter. I was working on the drafts of this legislation at earlier stages. I gather that there are people who are polishing the drafts now in order to reconcile the House and Senate versions. I've made these points about the offshore account jurisdiction to the people who are working on that. If they do something that's anodyne that just says within the jurisdiction of the United States, that's fine. So I think it will probably end up being okay, but I wanted to just sensitize this group to the salience of this issue. You'll hear sometimes people quote at you, well, only like 5 billion of the Russian assets are held in the United States. Well, yes, but there are probably 50 to 60 billion of the Russian assets are denominated in US dollars.
Thank you very much for all that. I understood a little bit of it, but not as much as I do now. Thank you. We've got 12 minutes. Why don't we give everybody a chance? One thing I want to say is, we've been talking about recommendations that FOUN makes and so forth. And this year's, those for the priority recommendations from Friends of Ukraine Network for U.S. assistance to Ukraine have now been finalized, and they are going to be going to the printer, and they'll be published soon. Last year's look like this, if anybody can see that. We will have those out, and everybody should understand, our audience and so forth, that once they're published, they go to every member of Congress, they go throughout the executive branch, they go other places, and then, and one of the veterans of all this is John Herbst, and others have participated, but I think he's participated more than anybody else. We then set up meetings, and we go and see people and explain why we're making these recommendations and ask and answer questions and so forth. So it's an ongoing process, and we use it for as long as we can get people's attention to listen to us. And those conversations over the past give us a chance to upgrade because of changed circumstances and so forth. But those recommendations are, and not every staffer will say this, but many have said to us that our recommendations help them with their work. Staffers on the Hill and so forth, because we don't say, give Ukraine another $200 million. We argue for specifics, weapon systems, and so forth. And I will add, for the last 2 years, and it's very much a part of this year's, the point that has been made over and over today is made in those recommendations that we need the United States to expound clearly an unequivocal policy of intending to see that Ukraine wins this war. So having said that, though, I think maybe we'll just have a lightning round and give everybody a chance to say a bit more. And Anders, we started with you. Why don't we start with you on a lightning round?
Thank you. Quickly, I think what Phil said here about the REPO Act, that's one thing that is extremely important within the next month. And the other part of it is $12 billion for the budget. The Ukrainian budget now has exactly $12 billion in unfinanced budget deficit because they have counted on $12 billion from the US. They are getting $25 billion from other sources, which is clear, but this is important. It's not important if it's a loan, as Phil suggested as a possibility, or if it is a grant, which is of course better, but the money needs to be forthcoming. Thank you.
John?
I think we've pretty much covered the waterfront. But again, I would come back to the fact that unless we shape up, unless we get this aid package done, unless we send more advanced weapons, not just do we risk loss in Europe, but we risk loss of our global leadership. And we can't afford that. That would cost us dearly, both in terms of security and in terms of prosperity.
Wes?
What can we do to put the pressure on the French to take the lead? John, can the Atlantic Council give Macron an award for leadership? And can this foundation, Friends of Ukraine, can we honor him in some way for his forward thinking? How do we positively put the onus on him to take the next step?
I don't know about the Atlantic Council doing what you've just said. They'd obviously be happy to host him, to give him a venue to make that point. But let's think about this.
Ed?
I just want to make a couple of quick points. One, because it's mentioned a number of times and is topical in the last few days. This whole idea that the administration, according to the press, has admonished Ukraine about attacking Russian refineries with the idea that somehow this is going to affect global oil prices. I mean, one, refineries are a totally legitimate military target. I think the generals would agree. These are refineries that produce the fuel, the jet fuel for Russian warplanes and the diesel for Russian tanks. So in terms of military objective, it's entirely legitimate. Meanwhile, Russia is destroying Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure. I mean, yesterday we had the mayor of Kharkiv saying that basically all vital energy infrastructure in Kharkiv had been destroyed by the Russians. So this is entirely legitimate. Secondly, which is more of an industry point, which is why I want to comment, is that it makes no sense that destroying Russian refineries or cutting their refinery runs would lead to a disruption in global oil supply or global oil prices. Since Ukraine is not hitting Russia's crude production facilities or its export facilities, the fact that the refinery runs are down, let's say by 10%, means that Russia has 10% more crude oil that it would put on the global market. I mean, it just fundamentally makes no industry economic sense. But it is an indication that the administration is more concerned, although misplaced and uninformed, by the prospect of $4 gasoline this summer in the United States than it is about Russian defeat or Ukrainian victory. The other point I would like to make to those in the audience who are listening and have cared to spend the time with us is do contact your elected officials, particularly representatives in Congress, about the urgency of getting this Ukraine assistance package passed. I mean, they are supposed to be on recess, and hopefully some of them are even in their home districts. So it should be easy for you to contact them. If you care about this issue, it's really important to weigh in with our elected representatives right now.
Thank you, Ed. Irina?
My recommendation would be to step up the work on the legal front. Unfortunately, administration dropped the ball here. There are so many legal issues that need to be addressed, and the Ukrainian government cannot cover it all. They're trying, the volunteer professional organizations are trying, but we have not enough support from the U.S. administration on this. And this war, is also a war on the global rule of law. So we are hoping to have much more support on the legal front, which we are not getting right now.
Thank you. Charles?
Yes, first I have to shout out Irina's background, which I believe, I can't see through her, but I believe says, this peoples are undefeatable. And it's an important message that we should all remember. I think it's also important that we continue to press on the remarkable achievements the Ukrainian government has made in economic reform in a variety of areas, from liberalization to reducing corruption. Anders can say much more about this. That and designing ways of encouraging rebuilding of infrastructure, returns of skilled labor. If we do that, redevelopment's critical, but the physical private capital will follow if we focus on that.
Thank you. Is Phil Breedlove still on? I don't see his picture. 1, 2, 3.
He signed off.
Okay. Phil, you want to add final?
Sure. Let me just add just one little note, because it's an issue that folks here may not be tracking. Probably when Johnson and the Republicans have their package and Hill, there's a good chance it will include legislation to reopen the LNG exports out of the Gulf of Mexico, which of course is Mike Johnson, Louisiana, all that. What I wanted to call out is that the LNG issue is actually really valuable for us in our Ukraine diplomacy. This is not, and so actually this is a situation where Johnson may be doing it for his reasons, but it's actually a good idea for our reasons. And friendly Democrats, we kind of might want to say, like, okay, this way President Biden doesn't have to recant what I think was a bad decision on LNG, taken in response to a small interest group without proper interagency consideration of all the implications of this. Because we're going to need LNG as a bargaining point in negotiations with the Japanese and the Europeans, and to alleviate some of the European energy challenges, which is constraining them in a lot of their decisions. For sure, the LNG issues are constraining the Japanese on the issue of frozen Russian assets. Now, that's not public, but that's true. And then if you want to address the Japanese concerns about LNG, our ability to supply LNG is constrained, et cetera. So, and by the way, one of the issues that's going on here in the Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries is the Russian retaliation against Ukrainian energy infrastructure was devastating. And I don't think the press has fully captured how devastating that was for Ukraine. And there are people in the administration who are nervous that Ukraine doesn't necessarily win that particular escalatory chain. Now, the Russians may just be attacking, will you attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure anyway? But that's a delicate problem. But anyway, the only bottom line I had for this group is when you notice the LNG issue come up in this context, getting more LNG supply helps us on Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you. Don?
I want to hear again and again for that the Ukrainians are fighting for us, the Ukrainians are fighting for democratic values, that this is not a great drain on the American purse, which Anderson hear that again and again and again, and you cannot say it too much. And the fact that Russia is a global threat to the United States, and for those of us in think tank land, John's comments about the Russia-China balance, I thought were brilliant and need to be said again and again. Other than that, I want to thank you and Nadia for herding this particularly mobile and distinguished herd of cats this morning.
Thanks, John. Our time is up. At the end of these things, I have so many thoughts. I can't capture them all, but I will say one, thank you everyone for participating, for being a part of this 10-year operation. I thank the ones that aren't here, that were here, and the ones that make up the 35 members of Friends of Ukraine Network for all their work and effort. I emphasize to the audience that when we work together, we put out documents and we advocate together, but every single member of the Friends of Ukraine Network, from my perspective, are working close to 24/7 in all aspects, press conferences, interviews, their own op-eds. They're traveling and influencing and I should emphasize, their personal channels of communication on the Hill and in the administration to advance the ideas that you've heard here today. And it's so important. We need to keep it up. We need to expand it. The more people in the public that will support this stuff, and we are suffering, it's come up before, we are suffering from a very small minority in Congress, mostly in the House, but they're in the Senate too, of people who have no appreciation or understanding of history. They couldn't have and come up with the positions that they're taking. And there's not a single argument that I have heard from the supposed Freedom Caucus that is working so hard against freedom. Their arguments do not stand up to elementary questioning, but they get away with it because they're not being challenged enough. We are a group to challenge what's going on. We are a group to support Ukraine and U.S. interests in Ukraine. I thank you all. I appreciate your attendance. I appreciate your work, and we'll be in touch in many other ways very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you all.